So my name is Jerry Truong, and I am currently 41 years old. I am an active practicing artist, educator, curator, and someone who works just in supporting the arts in the Washington, D.C. area. So I'm here today to talk about the story of my parents and their journey to the U.S., and then my own experience as a second-generation American, trying to navigate living sort of like in both cultures as a child of immigrants, then also as an American, trying to make my own way as an academic and as a practicing artist. So I want to start by talking about my parents, like, and their story. So my dad was born in Bac Lieu, Vietnam, and my mom was born in Dalat. And they both fled Vietnam in the late 1970s or so, and they arrived in the U.S. in the early 80s. And I think the interesting thing about my parents is that they both came from very different places. My dad grew up in a very poor, sort of farm, rural area. Both my parents actually came from gigantic families. My dad was the second youngest of 11 kids. And his family was sort of scattered, because he was so young and he had siblings that were a lot older. I'm sort of cloudy on the details of his family, just because a lot of them have moved to a lot of different places in the world, and a lot of them passed away a long time ago, just because of the age difference. But my dad, his family was pretty disjointed, and he ended up fleeing Vietnam after he had spent a couple years imprisoned in a re-education camp. The story that I've sort of gotten from my parents, and the thing I'm going to talk about later is just that a lot of this is just little pieces that I've sort of pieced together, parts I've pieced together, just over the years. But it seemed like he had been sort of captured in prison for a couple years, and then when he was immediately released, he fled straight to the U.S. right away, and he fled with two of his brothers, or three of his brothers, and they did so by boat. My mom, on the other hand, her family was a lot more sort of tight-knit. My grandfather, my mom's father, he was a relatively wealthy man. From what I could understand about him was that he was sort of like a merchant. He sold things, and they owned a bunch of houses in Dalat. And one of the things that my mom kind of talked about was that there was a lot of sort of anger and resentment against the communists because they stole all of my grandparents' homes, and then a lot of their money. My grandfather at one point became sick, and she had told me that there was a lot of fear about him being imprisoned, and so that spurred them to want to flee the country and go somewhere else. So with my mom, her story wasn't as straightforward. When they tried to flee, since her family was also really big, but my mom, though, was the oldest of 11 kids. And so there were a lot of younger siblings that she had. And at some point she had talked about how they had tried to flee, they had tried to get the whole family to sort of flee at the same time. But what happened was, on several occasions, some of the younger siblings got captured or got caught, and then they had to sort of reset, and then try again. And eventually, my grandparents decided to split up the family. So my grandfather decided to take the older half of the siblings, so my mom, and then I think it was five of the five older ones, and that they would then go to the U.S. via boat, and then my grandmother would stay behind with the six younger siblings in Vietnam. And so they eventually managed to do that. They went to Saigon, and then my mom said then they migrated, or they traveled to a coastal city, and then they were able to get onto a boat, and then they spent several days on the ocean, and they eventually landed in Thailand, where they stayed at like a refugee camp, and then eventually they were then transported to the United States. And so both my parents arrived in the United States in the early 80s. They didn't know each other. And one of the things that when they sort of like reflected on that time was that there were a lot of resources that they like were able to make use of. So when they got to America, everything was brand new. They didn't know the language, didn't know anything about the culture. And so, they relied a lot on like the church. And, it's still kind of vague, like when my mom says like just the church, or nyata, like it's not clear what denomination the church, but I would assume since we're Catholic, I was raised Catholic, that it was probably like the Catholic Church. And they were very fortunate to be able to take classes, to learn English. My mom took a class where she learned about like electronics, and there was sort of like vocational training, and that was where my parents eventually met. And they actually met relatively soon after coming from Vietnam. They dated for a while, fell in love, and then in 1982 was when they got married. I was born in 1983, so that's where my story sort of starts. By the time I sort of like was growing up and sort of aware of things, I think my parents by then were pretty well established in the U.S. My dad was working at like an electronics company, so he did make use of the training that he got. So he was working at Hewlett-Packard, and I would say my upbringing was, solidly like suburban American. Growing up, my parents would always talk about how we were like high class, but I think in reflecting upon like where we were and like the lifestyle that we had, I think was clearly middle class, and if we're generous, like maybe upper middle class. I had a pretty privileged, I felt like, childhood. We were in Folsom, California, which is a suburb of Sacramento. It was mostly, mostly white. Like, it wasn't a very diverse area. Most of my childhood, I was like the only Asian kid in my school. I was picked on quite a bit, just because I was like a quiet kid. I was kind of like nerdy. I liked video games, things like that. My mom, she was pretty much a stay-at-home mom, so we're very fortunate that she took care of us. My dad worked full-time, pretty long hours, and so I didn't see him as much, but I felt like looking back on my childhood that they made an effort to sort of like do things as a family. So I feel like I had a pretty solid like family foundation. In thinking back about my childhood, though, I think there were certain experiences that were unique just because I was, second generation, the first in my family to be born in the U.S. My sister and I, so for a long time it was just my sister, Angie, and I'm the oldest of all my siblings. And so for I think a good, 10 years or so, it was just her and I. And we were the only ones that could really speak English like strongly in my family. And so I think my parents had like a sort of reliance on us to do a lot of like translating. And I feel like that was something that instilled a lot of like sense of like responsibility in me. Even as a small child, like having to deal with a lot of like adult sort of issues. I definitely remember spending hours sometimes on the phone translating for my mom just because there was like an issue with the bills or something, or having to make an appointment for the dentist or the doctor and all those sort of things. So for me, I think being the oldest sibling, having to be responsible for those things really sort of like solidified my sort of role as like the anhai, or like the oldest brother in the family. And to this day, actually, everyone still calls me anhai. And like on my mom's side, since my mom's the oldest and I'm like the oldest son, I am like the anhai to everybody. So looking back on my childhood, I think my parents had, pretty sort of like standard sort of expectations for, I think, my siblings and I for what we wanted to do. So, that they would emphasize education. They wanted us to become dentists or doctors. And I think for the most part, I worked really hard to try to satisfy those expectations that they had. So I would say for most of my childhood and my teenage years, it's pretty standard. I think for me, things changed in sort of like the late 90s, the early 2000s, when I was sort of finishing up high school and sort of starting to think about college. In that my dad at that time decided to make a career change, and he was just sort of, the job that he was at. The company eventually sold the office or the building that he was at to another company, and then they transferred him to Irvine, to Southern California, and then that move, and then the shift in the working environment. Again, like I'm not quite clear about like the details about it or like his feelings, because we didn't quite talk about those things, and but it seemed like there was some unhappiness there. And so at some point, my parents decided to shift gears. My dad left his job. They moved to Portland, Oregon, where we had some family. And then they decided to, at first open up like a fast food, sort of Chinese food restaurant there. And then they eventually partnered with our family and they opened up like a pho restaurant. And I think their sort of life situation or financial situation changed pretty dramatically. And so they sort of shifted from being solidly like middle class, I think, to what I would probably characterize like working poor. By that point, my parents then had two other children, so I had two other siblings, so there were four of us in total. And it's kind of interesting, there's actually a 10-year sort of like split. So I'm the oldest. Angie is a year younger. I have a sister named April who's 10 years younger than me. And then my parents waited another 10 years for my little brother, Daniel. So by the time they moved to Portland, it was, in a tiny one-bedroom apartment. It was like, my parents, there was like Angie was living there. By that point, she was like in her early 20s. There was April, who, so like, by that point in like her sort of like early teens. And then Daniel, who's like essentially like a little baby. And so, there's just sort of kind of interesting dynamic, because my parents were working very hard, very long hours. At the restaurant, my mom would usually be the one taking orders, sort of running around, bussing tables, things like that. My dad was like cooking. And they were there from like early morning to late night, and so it was definitely a struggle. I think during that time, Angie was at home and she was trying to like essentially raise my little brother. For me, I was like fortunate. Like the timing was just like my parents moved to Portland, and that was just right when I was leaving for college, and so I ended up going to the University of California in Irvine. And so while they were going through all that, I was just sort of separated from it. And so I could sort of watch it from afar. When I was at UC Irvine, I took the opportunity to go in undeclared. So I went in without a specific major. And for me, I thought that was a pretty radical move, right? Because I think there was a lot of pressure for me to go in. It's like, something pre-med, or I think at one point they even like settled, because I like computers and I like playing video games and stuff, that they tried to push me to go into like engineering or something like that. But I just wanted to give myself an opportunity to try out things. I think when I was in school, I was good at math, I was kind of good in the sciences. And so, I definitely had that in the back of my mind, but I wanted to see if, I had like other, maybe there were other things that I could try out, or I had some other skills. So one of the things that I was fortunate to be able to do was in satisfying some of like the general education requirements when I was in school, was that I took a couple different like art classes. And for me, like there was just something so exciting about the world of art. Like I didn't know anything about art, like other than the basics that you sort of learn about in elementary school. Like I maybe knew who Picasso was, but anything that was sort of contemporary, I had no idea about. So for me, it was like so incredibly exciting. Even something as just sort of, as sort of simple as the fact that, taking a drawing class, that people actually draw like nude models, like kind of like blew my mind. Like that was something that people do. So I definitely grew up, I feel like, very sort of, with kind of like a limited sort of worldview of that aspect of our culture. And so I dove right in. So for me, like the ideas of like, like modern art, contemporary art, like all those sort of like concepts were so exciting. And I definitely had like some skill. I think I was very, just a generally patient person, very skilled with my hands. I mean, I whenever we had like school projects and stuff, I liked building things. I would never have considered myself a creative person. Like I definitely would never have described myself as like an artist or, imagine that I would become an artist. But I think there was just like, this like excitement about it. And so I just kind of dove right into it. But I also understand too that, like it was something that was pretty jarring for my parents, like, cause they didn't know what art was. And I also, still maybe, had that sense of responsibility as like, the big brother, that it wasn't like I could do something as irresponsible as being an artist and not know what that could lead into as a career. And so I think as sort of a compromise to my parents, since I also like really enjoyed psychology, that I decided to double major in psychology as well. And so I think when they heard that for them, that was something that was sort of acceptable, that as long as he was studying psychology and that I could become a psychiatrist or psychologist or something that, could become, a workable sort of like realistic career, that it didn't matter what else I was studying sort of on the side. And I think, when I was studying, I think there was like a real sort of like, I was trying to navigate both sides. Like I think I really did consider potentially, going into like research or doing something, sort of like, more so like mental health sort of related. So I definitely considered that for a time. But I think what I enjoyed the most was being in the studio, making work. And then also something else that sort of like helped me in my journey was that I think I understood early on that when you want to do something, when you want to learn something, that you have to seek out people who are like, like the best, like as established of a person as you can in that field. And so when I was at UC Irvine, when I was studying psychology, I met Donald Hoffman, who is a pretty established like researcher in the field of like I was helping him with research about false memory. He's doing a lot of like really exciting research and stuff in like the cognitive sciences. It was also around this time when I met Daniel Joseph Martinez, who would become my mentor in the arts, and he's just such an out there character. Like he's someone that makes really radical art, and he has this like excitement about him about the possibilities of art. And so I was drawn to these two different people who were sort of at the forefront of what they were doing, right? And so through Daniel, that's where I learned everything that I know now about art. The idea that art communicates, personal experiences, and that art is, just the making of art is a political process, right? That art cannot be separate from politics because, even the economic, social system that supports the arts, a lot of times connects back into that political apparatus. So for me, since I learned art in college, everything that I knew about, the role of an artist, how to make art, how to think about art, all that is just connected to politics and the sort of conceptual approach to art. One of the things that I carry from my training or my education is that art without a concept, like art that isn't about something, is like a person without a soul, right? That there's just then it's just pointless, it's frivolous, it's decoration. And so for me, like when I was in school, I was very sort of engaged with trying to understand like politics. I was also dealing with like issues with like myself as an Asian American person and like our roles in society, and trying to understand the history behind like where I was coming from. And so a lot of my work, I think, at the time was sort of dealing with issues that, while I sort of like was going through it, like trying to navigate American culture, living in these two worlds, being bilingual, I did feel removed from it, so I was making sort of like work that sort of spoke to like my parents and like their experience, right? I remember I did a project where I took photographs of these, workers, like Chinese workers, back when they were like building the transnational like railroad. And what I did was I edited out the landscape, and it was just all these pictures of all these like workers, these men who are like kind of like isolated, right? Because at the time there were laws that were enacted that didn't allow them to marry, to become, they weren't allowed to become citizens. So I was just sort of imagining, these people that were just completely isolated, emotionally, politically, socially. And so I wanted to create an image where it showed them isolated, like physically, right? And so I was doing a lot of works like that, sort of like commentating on things that I was sort of learning about. And I continued to do that, make art like that, I think, for the rest of my sort of undergrad career. I think things shifted for me after I graduated, because then once I graduated college in 2000, it was like 2005, 2006 was when I graduated. And there was a time when, I considered maybe pursuing art, or like I considered maybe going to get a PhD. I also did a lot of like sort of odd jobs at the time. Eventually, I just, like in sort of reflecting on like my life up to that point, I was like, I was happiest when I was like in the studio, when I was making art. And I really felt like there was like a purpose to what I was doing, that there was something that I wanted to share, from my experiences and my perspective. And so I eventually decided to pursue my Master's of Fine Arts at the University of California, San Diego. And so while I was there, I worked with professors and stuff and really tried to interrogate my art practice. And I think one of the things that came out of that was the sort of perspective or the advice of my advisors was that I was making art, but there was like a disconnect, right? Like I was making things that, it felt like I was commentating on something that I actually had no experience with. I grew up solidly suburban, middle class. I didn't have to go through those, specific struggles that immigrants, like the suffering that my parents went through. Like I didn't experience those things. I heard about them secondhand, and my parents were sort of like not necessarily secretive about their experiences, like migrating. They were boat people. I had sort of understood that the journey for them was incredibly difficult, that it was dangerous. I definitely understood that they were, while they were on the ocean, they were like starving, they were incredibly thirsty. My dad actually lost his one of his brothers actually in the ocean. He fell in and then he disappeared, he drowned. But my parents never talked about those things. And so it's kind of interesting, like I had these like memories, like I knew these things. And it wasn't like, for me, it wasn't necessarily like a mystery why I knew these things. Like they never talked to us about it, they weren't very straightforward about it. But when you're like a child and you're sort of playing, running around like the dinner table and adults are sort of like talking, you do absorb these things. You listen to the conversation, you do sort of remember things, or little bits and pieces sort of come up, and then wonder about, who's this person that they're talking about. So, for example, like my uncle, right, my dad's brother. So the thing to understand about that, like the thing about Vietnamese sort of culture and how Vietnamese talk about family is that they number all the family members, right? So I am like the Anh. So it's kind of interesting because the oldest sibling is like the number 2, so I'm like the oldest brother, Anh, right? And then my sister would be like, I don't know, like Chị Ba or something. And then once you become like aunts and uncles, then you have the sort of title of that position in the family, but you still maintain the numbering in the family, right? And so you can sort of track people based on how you call them. So I have like an aunt who's like, I'm like sort of like, but like Bác Chín or something, right? So he's like my uncle who's like number 9, but then technically he's like, the number 8th person born in his family, right? So there's a sort of ordering that happens in the family. And so, like on my mom's side, we knew everyone's numbers because I grew up with them. I was very close with them. On my dad's side, it's just like, I knew certain ones. I knew my aunt who was number 4, and I knew my aunt who was number 5, and my uncle who's like number 9, and my dad, is like the 10th born, right? And so there's a sort of sense of that, of the ordering, but then there was like, like an uncle that was there in between that I just never knew about, And then at some point I just understood that my dad had lost a brother on the journey or something. So I came to then just understand that, like there was someone who drowned during that, that trip on the boat. So for me, there were like a lot of these sort of like loose pieces that were sort of like all over the place that I was trying to make sense of. And so for me, I think during my graduate studies is really about sort of trying to understand that. Just trying to understand memory and trying to understand how different generations like transmit those sort of memories. And one of the things I think was very fortunate for me when I was at the University of California, San Diego, or at UCSD, was that they really encouraged like interdisciplinary sort of like study and, like working with other departments. And so, I was taking classes in like ethnic studies and, working with people who are like in history and stuff. And so thinking about those things, like thinking about, the sort of informal archive, right? Like all these different things that we transmit that isn't necessarily written down in history books, right? Like the stories that we tell each other and the other ways that, like history is sort of embodied, right? And you reenact them, like performances and things like that. So, so I was thinking about all that. And then at the same time, I was starting to look at artists that were making art that was just like non-traditional. I think I'd come from my schooling, I'd come from a place where we're making objects, UC Irvine was pretty radical, like in terms of its like, art making approach, but, I was still making sculptures and doing photography and drawing, right? And so I started looking at artists that were doing like performance. And I think for a lot of those artists, like, in the 80s, like in the 70s and the 80s, for them, they were really pushing the boundaries of what we sort of like characterize as art, right? Like doing a sort of endurance performance where you like lay on glass for a certain amount of time. For them, it was like, trying to sort of like fight with like the art establishment and trying to establish that, what I'm doing is legitimate art. So for them, like their purpose was different. But what I sort of took from it or was looking at it was that, when you do these sort of things, you do put yourself in a different kind of psychological space, And so I kind of wanted to appropriate sort of the aesthetics of that movement, right, of people who are doing that type of performance, but then have this sort of psychological aspect where, through the performance, maybe I could connect to something else, And so one of my sort of like early, I would say like successful pieces was where I decided that I would isolate myself in the studio, and then I laid down a piece of paper And then I took this like pencil and I just wrote the word bien over and over again, right? And I thought the word bien was the appropriate word because it in Vietnamese means like ocean, so bien. But then because Vietnamese is like a tonal like language, depending on how you change the symbols, it could also represent bien, like transform or change. And so I was thinking about how as I'm sort of writing this word over and over again, that I'm sort of creating this kind of like field or like something that kind of becomes like an ocean or this space that one has to navigate like physically. But then I was also trying to like change myself. I was trying to transform myself, put myself in a place where maybe I lose my sense of self and then maybe figure something else out, or like understand something else, uncover something new, And so with the performance, I decided that I was going to do this. I was going to write the word bien as long as I physically could, right? And I was just by myself in the studio with the camera, like on the floor, recording myself doing this. I ended up doing it for about 4 hours or so. I think eventually, I was just physically exhausted, because I was doing it on my arms, like on my elbows and on my knees. And I kind of wanted to be in that position because for me, it kind of felt reminiscent of someone like sort of like praying or someone meditating or like chanting. And that was important to me because, I think I had mentioned that I was raised Catholic. Because my mom's family is Catholic. My dad was actually raised Buddhist. My dad was actually Buddhist, but he converted to Catholicism because my grandfather wouldn't allow my parents to marry unless he was Catholic. So he converted. I would say my dad is like a bad Catholic. I mean, he would probably call himself a Catholic. He never goes to church or anything like that. But we would go to temple sometimes. Like when my dad's parents passed, we went and honored them at the temple, so we went to temple. So there was this sort of connection. I felt like both sides of my family with this idea of connected, being connected to one's ancestors, being on your knees, chanting, praying, meditating. So I felt like both sides of my family in terms of our sort of spiritual, religious sort of upbringing connected to that. So when I was doing this performance, I wanted to be in that position. So I was like, if I'm going to draw, then I need to be on my hands and my knees. And so, I did it for 4 hours. After I was just too tired, after shifting on my knees and they were all bruised, I was like, the performance was over. Right. And so in the end, I think the sort of result of that piece was I had a drawing that just had the word bien over and over again, just like this overwhelming long sheet of paper that was written out. Then I had this video documentation of it. And then it was also a performance too. So I was kind of excited in this one action resulted in all of these different pieces, and different ways of thinking about it. And so I really think that sort of became the thing that would sort of lay the foundation for a lot of my work that would come out later on, right? So for me, I think that was an important time in my development as an artist. Shifting away from, sort of commentating on this history that, while it was connected to my family and, connected to, to some aspects of my identity, that I just didn't experience and I just really didn't feel connected to really trying to find a way to actually make it a part of myself and what it is that I do. And so I think that's where I sort of am now with my work, really trying to bring those things together, right? So one of the things I do want to talk about is just my current work and this piece that I have behind me, because it is sort of connected to my mom's journey, even though it's not so obvious, right? So I had mentioned earlier that on my mom's side, when they tried to flee Vietnam, they tried many times, right? And so they got out to the beach, and then because my little aunt was snatched in the middle of the night, they all had to return back. They couldn't leave a little girl in Vietnam, right? And so that happened many times. So for my mom, being able to cross from the land to get into the water where the boat was, like that was a boundary that they couldn't cross, right? And so I'd heard that story at some point when I was a child, and I definitely remember sort of like imagining people like running out onto like a beach, so I had this image of like a beach in my mind. And so I wanted to create something that, sort of, harken back to that childhood memory, but also represented that boundary that my mother couldn't cross, right? So this drawing here, represents that boundary, that line. So, so in the bottom part here, I sort of like use charcoal and incense ash to render the ocean, or like the sand in the beach, and then the upper part, you have the waves. And so this was something that for my mom's side, right, they couldn't like cross this. Now there are actually 3 other panels that sort of mirror this one, and that one represents or depicts the ocean with the horizon line, with the sky, and that was in thinking about my dad's journey and the fact that my uncle who fell into the ocean, the line between water and air was one that he couldn't cross over, right? And I've also done other pieces about him as well. Just sort of like I did a piece where I had I took a bunch of dirt and I had built a box, and I took clothing that was sort of characteristic of the time, sort of like the late 70s, the early 80s. So I just kind of imagined, what he might have been wearing. I took this clothing and I embedded it in like, this box full of dirt. And then after I removed like the box, you had this sort of like block of earth that just sort of looked like it was excavated out of, like the ground, like out of the beach or something. So I sort of imagined what it would look like, the shell of a person left behind after they sort of disappeared, vanished. And so thinking about that, trying to make sense of like my memories of this person that I didn't know anything about, and so I think my work is really trying to do that. So interrogate that aspect. So just like these sort of like memories that one sort of has, and, memories that maybe I inherited from my parents. I think that was kind of an exciting sort of concept that, there is sort of like, more than just your genes. There are certain things that we sort of get from our parents, even if they're not like necessarily physical, right? They're not as tangible. And then also, I think there were also experiments with like meaning and material, I think, with this piece, in that I was thinking about, like drawing, and the fact that I was using charcoal. And I think this was also right around the time when my grandmother, my dad's my dad's mother had passed, and we had lit some like incense for her. So my parents don't maintain like an altar in their home, but I know a lot of Vietnamese families do. And whenever we have like sort of like a funeral or even like a ceremony, where we want to like honor like our ancestors, they'll set up like a makeshift sort of like altar in the home. And so what a lot of Vietnamese people will do is they'll like lay out like a plate with like fruit, and the idea is that our ancestors, the spirit of our ancestors, enjoy the fruit, and then after it's like ripened, after they've enjoyed it, then we as people then enjoy it. But I think for me, what was sort of interesting in trying to understand that is that for Vietnamese people, the past is constant. It's always present, right? That your ancestors, the spirit of your ancestors are living with you. They are there, right? Everyone is there together. And so the past is like very much like alive. And so I was thinking about, again, this idea that when I make artwork, that I'm sort of like commentating on the past or trying to represent things from my parents. Like that was something I've always struggled with, and I think for me to make it relevant, then I wanted this, like to be able to make it feel like, the past that I'm dealing with is current, and that it is alive and it is present. And so with these drawings in charcoal, I decided to incorporate the ash from incense. So I burnt a bunch of incense, and then I collected the ash, and then I would sort of like, rub it in there into the drawing. So, so this, so when you're using something like incense ash, it's very delicate. I would say, if anyone has drawn with like vine charcoal, it's very similar. It would be something that would be more appropriate for like sketching. It's not really going to make like a dark mark or anything. So for me, I don't think there's an actual sort of like aesthetic or like practical sort of use of the material, but really it's just sort of the meaning behind it. And so here then, I think the way I like to think about it is that the act of drawing then becomes performative, right? So even though the final result is like the drawing that you see on the wall, for me, the whole process of burning the incense, thinking about my parents and my ancestors, and incorporating the material, even if I'm just kind of rubbing it in there, just so that the particles are in there, I think all of that becomes a part of the work, right? And that's sort of where I've kind of like settled, I think, with my art practice, like really trying to understand that. So a current piece that I want to talk about is this drawing. There's a drawing over here. And this is one that I'm like currently like struggling with. So I've been working with this piece now, I think, for about like 6 months or so. Originally, it was just going to be a drawing of the ocean, I think, because there was a lot of interest in like the large panels. It was a very successful piece for me. Just in that, whenever I have opportunities for exhibition, it's usually the piece that people want to show. It's just like, beautiful, and it's something that's really accessible, even though I'm dealing with like, this history that's very specific. And being in DC, there is a like significant Vietnamese community in this area. They may not be as engaged with the art. So, as an artist, I think my audience isn't familiar with that. But the piece, since it is a beautiful landscape and there's like a grand scale to it, I think it makes it like accessible to the audience here in DC. And so there's just a lot of interest in this piece and other similar ones that I've made. So I think I was trying to like, create a similar type of scene with the ocean, right? And so this piece originally started off with like a horizon, and I was like kind of creating the waves. And then I just was in the studio and working on it, and I just really struggled with where this was going. Like I didn't know what the focus was going to be. I didn't know, like how it would evolve past the waves. I really struggled with the sky. And I just remember being here in the studio one night, and I was just like so frustrated. Like it takes me hours and hours. Like the larger piece, I mean, this took me like 3 months to make these, and I've had pieces that I've worked on even longer than that. This piece, I think, after I'd worked on it for like 2 months or so, I got so frustrated with it that I just ended up like putting charcoal and just blacking everything out. So it just all became this kind of black thing. And then I was kind of looking at it. Now it become like this vast sort of void. I didn't know where it was going. I was going to like abandon it. And then, like I was starting to think about, all the people that disappear into the ocean, including my uncle. And I wanted a way to like represent them. And so I came up with the solution of like the Vietnamese, sort of like straw hat that people would wear like in the fields, and it sort of had become something that was characteristic of, like the imagery, or like, the sort of imagery that you would see when you think of Vietnam. Now, I don't know if this works. I don't know if the final version, if I'm going to have that or not. I mean, sometimes I struggle with it, and this is kind of like the struggle that I think I currently have with my, not only my art practice, but within myself. But, I don't know if this is something that feels like, like a sincere sort of representation of, of like the struggles of, like the boat people, or if it's like sort of using it as sort of like a shorthand for, a group of people's like sort of experiences, right? So I sort of struggle with it. I might sort of do something else, but yeah, so that's where I'm currently at the moment. And so just going back to where I think I currently am, I'm going to continue making work. I'm going to figure out other ways to sort of connect with my my heritage and the experiences of my parents. I think as I sort of get to a place where, as I'm sort of getting older, I feel further and further away from those stories. And I think that's actually where my parents actually are too. I think in sort of reflecting on their experiences, I recently actually had a conversation with my parents. And during that conversation, I asked them, thinking back on those experiences, if they had, any sort of takeaway or any feelings about the Vietnam War, things like that. And, it was more sort of maybe more of an academic conversation than a personal sort of conversation with them. But the thing with my parents aren't academics. They're not, they're not, reflecting on those things in their everyday life, right? And so I think something that was just sort of eye-opening for me was that my mom told me that she hadn't thought about the Vietnam War in 40 years, right? It's just not something that they even think about. That they put it away and it's a part of the past for them. And I think for me it makes sense. My parents, they felt very fortunate to be here in the U.S. They, fled Vietnam because of terrible conditions. They wanted to establish themselves in this country, right? And they did that. And so for them, when they look back on the war, it's not something that they think about fondly at all. That for them, there's no sort of nostalgia, I think, about life the way that it was before. They very much love Vietnamese culture. My parents, still, eat exclusively Vietnamese food. My dad goes to get his haircut at a Vietnamese shop. My parents only speak Vietnamese to each other. I actually tease my mom that, she's lived in the U.S. for 40 years, but her English is still terrible. Actually, to this day, I still have to translate for her constantly. I literally had to make an appointment for her for the dentist just the other day. So I still have to do those sort of things. My parents, when they're at home, they just sit and watch YouTube videos, but more touristy sort of videos of Vietnam. But we're sort of reflecting on their experiences, I think it was a lot of my sort of childhood. There are little things that sort of come up in small conversations, or if they're talking to a family member or something, they might reference something, but it's not something that's active in their lives, right? So for me, as I've sort of gotten older and further away from those experiences as well, so I think, I'm at a place right now where I sort of struggle with it. In some ways, I feel like being Vietnamese and having that sort of unique sort of aspect to my family history, I think has been something that's been very, I felt like it's been fortunate. I've had opportunities shown in exhibitions, made connections, I think because of that. But then also I think there have been a lot of times where I felt sort of constrained by it, restricted. If I wanted to make work that was just, formal or just, about color or about mark making, there's always some sort of reading that's connected back to the fact that I'm Vietnamese, right? I remember there was a time when I did make works that dealt with other parts of American history, and then I showed it to a curator in DC, and they're like, why are you making this kind of stuff? They said, anyone else can make this, and other people are making work like this, but you have something else that's unique, and that you should focus on that. And so in some ways, I feel sort of limited. And for me, I think I'm just at a place where I'm sort of struggling with those things. I think right now, I still try to make work. I'm not as active as an artist, I think, as I used to be. And I think it's because of that. As I feel less and less sort of emotionally invested or connected to the things I'm making, I'm not as excited to make them. And so I think where I'm most excited at the moment is just sort of focusing on my sort of role as an educator, teaching. I also am doing a lot more curating, so working with artists and then trying to be a sort of vehicle for their ideas. And I think that's ultimately where I've sort of functioned as an artist, right? That I, in some ways, am a vehicle for my parents, right? And trying to tell their story and represent the things that they went through visually. And then for other artists, then I'm trying to take, like what it is that they're working through, their concepts, and then, putting together exhibitions or, connecting them with other resources so that they can then, get their voice out. So.